Rachel Myers had built her life around rules, order, and a fierce sense of responsibility. As one of the few female officers in her department, she carried the weight of proving herself every day. From the outside, her life looked solid. She was respected, disciplined, and admired for her ability to stay calm under pressure. But when she took off her badge at the end of a shift, she often returned to a small, quiet apartment where the silence was louder than any crime scene. Loneliness had crept into her life in ways she never wanted to admit. She wanted companionship, someone who saw her not just as the officer who could handle anything, but as a woman who needed love, trust, and care. It was during one of her off-duty visits to a local gym that she met Daniel Brooks. He was tall, confident, and had the kind of easy charm that made people gather around him. His smile seemed warm, his energy inviting, and for a woman like Rachel who had built emotional walls for so long, his attention felt like a relief. Daniel worked as a fitness trainer, and his life seemed centered around health, positivity, and motivation. He approached Rachel casually at first, offering tips during her workout sessions, joking lightly to ease her tension, and gradually slipping into her routine like he had always been part of it. For Rachel, it was refreshing. She had always been cautious in relationships, skeptical of anyone who tried to get too close. But Daniel disarmed her. He wasn't intimidated by her badge, and he didn't seem to care about the authority that others sometimes tiptoed around. Instead, he treated her like a woman who deserved attention and affection. It didn't take long before late-night texts became daily phone calls, casual gym chats turned into dinners, and their lives began to intertwine. Their relationship moved quickly, faster than Rachel ever thought she would allow. Her friends at the department noticed changes in her. She seemed lighter, more open, as if the guarded shell she carried had cracked. She laughed more, her energy returned, and she finally looked forward to something outside of work. Weekends became their time, dinners at small restaurants, walks in the park, movie nights on her couch. She started imagining a future with him, something stable, something different from the chaos she witnessed every day in her line of work. Rachel often thought about how safe she felt with him, how different it was from dealing with the criminals she chased on the job. Daniel spoke about his dreams of opening his own gym one day, of wanting to travel, of wanting to build a life filled with purpose. She believed in his words, trusted in the sincerity of his plans. To her, it felt like she had finally found balance. For once, her life wasn't just about responding to emergencies or surviving the weight of trauma. It was about building something with someone who seemed to care. But even during the happiness, there were small moments that should have unsettled her. Daniel avoided deep questions about his past. He was vague about certain parts of his life, brushing off details with a smile or changing the subject. Rachel noticed, but she chose not to push too hard. She told herself everyone had things they didn't want to share too soon, and maybe he just wasn't ready. After years of disappointment, she didn't want to sabotage what felt so real. She ignored the quiet voice inside her that questioned why a man who seemed so perfect carried shadows he refused to explain. Their relationship continued to deepen. Daniel began spending more time at her apartment, leaving little reminders of himself scattered around, jackets draped over a chair, a toothbrush in her bathroom, his cologne lingering in the air. She grew used to his presence, and the thought of life without him felt unbearable. It was as though she had finally opened her heart after years of locking it away, only to find herself addicted to the closeness they shared. Rachel believed she had found the one person she could trust completely. She allowed herself to dream about marriage, about children, about a normal life she had secretly longed for. She thought Daniel was her safe harbor, the answer to her silent prayers. But what she could not see, what she refused to imagine, was that Daniel's charm was not as harmless as it seemed. Beneath the smile, behind the comforting embrace, there was a truth that would one day shatter her world and leave her standing on a path of devastation. For now, she remained blissfully unaware, caught in a love story that was nothing more than the opening act of her darkest chapter. Rachel had always trusted her body. As an officer, her health was her armor. Every morning run, every balanced meal, every routine checkup reminded her that discipline protected her not only in the field, but in life, that confidence began to fade. One restless week, when she woke up feeling more exhausted than usual. At first she blamed the long shifts, the constant demands of paperwork, and the never-ending pressure of being on call. But the fatigue lingered. Soon came fevers at night, an unsettling ache in her joints, and a foggy feeling in her mind that she couldn't shake off. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she was simply overworked. Yet, deep down she knew something was wrong. When the headaches grew sharper and the exhaustion worsened, Rachel scheduled an appointment at a local clinic. Sitting in the sterile examination room, she told herself it would be nothing serious. Maybe anemia, maybe stress. She was used to her body responding to rest and recovery, and she expected the same outcome now. But when the doctor walked in with a tightened expression, holding her file a little too carefully, Rachel felt her chest tighten. The words came slowly, deliberately. She had tested positive for HIV. Her mind went blank, her ears buzzing, as if the world around her had been muted. She sat frozen, staring at the floor, as the doctor explained treatment options and next steps. All Rachel could think about was how impossible it seemed. She had been careful her entire life, careful with her choices, careful with her career, careful with her body, and then the realization cut through her denial like a knife. Daniel. He was the only new factor in her life, the only person she had trusted intimately in recent months. Panic bled into anger, as the truth began to take shape in her mind. In the days that followed, her emotions spiraled. Shock, fear, despair, and rage tangled together, until she could hardly separate them. She stayed home from work, staring at her reflection in the mirror, unable to recognize the woman looking back. The strong officer who had once taken down violent criminals now felt powerless, as though her life had been stolen from her in silence. She replayed every moment with Daniel, every laugh, every kiss, every promise, wondering how much of it had been a lie. Her suspicions hardened into certainty. The day she searched through Daniel's belongings while he was at the gym. She hadn't planned it, but her desperation left her no choice. Rummaging through his closet and gym bag, she stumbled upon a folded stack of papers. Her hands trembled as she unfolded them, scanning the medical records that spelled out a history of treatment and diagnosis. Daniel had known about his HIV status for years. He had chosen to keep it from her. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound she had faced in her career. This wasn't just deception. It was a deliberate act of cruelty. The discovery twisted Rachel's grief into fury. Every time she thought about the nights they spent together, she no longer saw love. She saw manipulation. She thought about the women she had seen him flirt with at the gym, the clients he charmed, and the new faces that came and went in his life. The realization that she was likely not his first victim filled her with dread. How many others had he lied to? How many lives had he put at risk? Her anger burned hotter each time she considered the possibility that Daniel had been living without care for the destruction he left behind. Rachel's training as an officer made her instinctively seek evidence. She combed through his papers, searching his drawers, scanning his phone when she had the chance. She noticed messages from women she didn't recognize, vague and casual, yet full of the same charm he had used on her. Each new discovery deepened her sense of betrayal. She had built her life around rules and justice, yet here she was, the victim of a crime that felt too intimate for the courts to ever understand. Her body was suffering, her mind unraveling, and her trust shattered. Nights became unbearable. She would lie awake staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of the doctor's voice telling her the truth she could not escape. The silence of her apartment, once comforting, now felt suffocating. She began to imagine Daniel's smile not as the grin of a man in love, but as the mask of someone who had stolen her future. Each memory became distorted, twisted into proof of his deceit. Her heart had broken once, when she first learned the diagnosis, but it shattered entirely when she accepted the reality. Daniel had known. He had taken away, not only her health but her sense of safety, her belief in love, and her control over her own life. Rachel had spent years protecting others from harm, only to discover that the danger had come from the one person she had let closest to her heart. And as the days passed, her grief began to transform into something far more dangerous than sorrow. Rachel had always been trained to compartmentalize her emotions, to separate her private feelings from her duty as an officer. But now, there was no dividing line. The betrayal she carried seeped into everything. Her work, her sleep, her very sense of identity. She went to work, put on the uniform, and wore the face of a professional. But underneath the calm exterior, her mind was boiling. Every call she responded to, every suspect she interrogated, reminded her of the man who had deceived her, the man who had turned her life into a slow-burning nightmare. She started to see Daniel not as her lover but as a predator, someone who had carefully wrapped her in lies and poisoned her trust. Her thoughts consumed her. On patrol, she found herself drifting, not fully present, as if her body was moving on autopilot while her mind replayed the same questions over and over. Why had he chosen her? How many others were there? How long had he been doing this? She began searching for answers in places where most wouldn't look. She started spending her evenings driving past the gym where Daniel worked, parking her cruiser at a distance, watching him leave with his clients. She studied the way he laughed with them, his hand resting lightly on their shoulders, his voice carrying an easy charm. It was the same charm he had used to win her over. To Rachel, every smile he offered another woman felt like another crime being committed, another life possibly put in danger. The more she watched him, the more her obsession grew. She began keeping notes, jotting down the times he arrived, the times he left, the faces of the women who interacted with him. What had started as suspicion became a case file in her own mind. She tracked his patterns with the precision she would use for a dangerous criminal, his routes, his habits, even the way he seemed to vanish for hours with no clear explanation. Rachel documented it all. Each detail reinforced her growing certainty that Daniel was not just reckless, but deliberate in his actions. Her apartment, once a place of rest, became a command center. Papers were spread across her table, lists of names, dates, and observations, written in sharp handwriting. Sleep no longer came easily. When she did close her eyes, she dreamed of him smiling, then dreamed of herself falling into an abyss she could not climb out of. The bitterness inside her deepened, carving out the woman she used to be, and leaving behind someone unrecognizable. Her colleagues began to notice changes in her demeanor. She was quieter, withdrawn, her sharp humor gone. When asked if she was okay, she brushed it off with excuses about being tired. She couldn't tell them the truth. To admit what had happened would mean exposing her vulnerability, admitting that she, a trained officer, had been deceived in the most intimate way. Instead, she carried the burden alone, letting it twist her thoughts in silence. What frightened Rachel most was how natural the obsession felt. She justified her actions by telling herself she was preventing others from being hurt. If she kept watch, if she gathered enough evidence, maybe she could stop him. But deep down, her reasons were no longer about justice. They were about revenge. She didn't want to hand Daniel over to the system. She wanted him to feel the weight of everything he had done to her, the destruction he had left behind. She wanted him to understand fear the way she did now, to feel powerless the way he had made her feel. Her days became consumed by a cycle of anger and despair. At work, she handled cases with mechanical precision, but her mind wandered back to him. Off-duty, she sat in her car near his house, watching the lights flicker on and off, wondering what lies he was telling inside. Each passing day eroded the line between officer and victim, between professional detachment and personal vengeance. The Rachel who once believed in justice, in rules and order, was fading, replaced by someone darker, someone who was willing to take matters into her own hands. The tipping point came late one evening, when she spotted him walking out of the gym with another young woman. They laughed together, their heads leaning close, their voices carrying in the cool night air. Rachel's stomach twisted. She imagined the woman's future, doctor visits, tears. The same devastating words Rachel herself had heard. The thought ignited something inside her, a cold fire that spread through her veins. She no longer saw Daniel as simply a man who had betrayed her. She saw him as a ticking time bomb, a danger that no court would ever truly punish the way he deserved. The decision hadn't yet taken form in her mind, but the seed was planted that night. She couldn't walk away, couldn't let him continue to destroy lives. The anger that had been simmering for weeks was now boiling, threatening to spill over. She began to realize she was no longer just observing him. She was preparing herself for something far more final. The storm that night seemed to mirror the chaos inside Rachel. Rain fell in heavy sheets against her windshield as she sat outside Daniel's house, the wipers struggling to keep up. Thunder rolled in the distance, each rumble shaking her already unsteady resolve. She had been parked there for nearly an hour, watching the faint light glowing from his living room window. He had invited her over earlier that day, his voice light, casual, as if nothing in the world was wrong. For him, it was just another night with his girlfriend. For her, it was the moment where everything she had bottled up would finally reach its breaking point. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale, her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat. She thought about the months of lies, the stolen future, the diagnosis that had shattered her sense of self. She thought about the women she had seen him with, laughing at his charm, unaware of the hidden danger. Rage twisted inside her, but it was layered with despair so heavy that it made her chest ache. It wasn't only about what Daniel had done to her, it was about how he had turned her into someone she barely recognized. When she finally stepped out of the car, the rain drenched her instantly. She walked toward the door with deliberate steps, her badge clipped at her side, her service weapon concealed beneath her jacket. She had rehearsed this moment in her head, without even realizing it, each scenario playing out in fragments of thought on countless sleepless nights. Now those fragments had pieced themselves into reality. She knocked once, and Daniel appeared, smiling in that same disarming way that once melted her defenses. The sight of it made her stomach churn. Inside, the warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the storm outside. The smell of dinner cooking on the stove filled the air, a mockery of normalcy. He welcomed her in, speaking casually, moving with the ease of a man who believed he still had control. Rachel's eyes darted around the room, her focus sharp, her body tense. She was no longer the woman who once felt safe here. Every detail seemed sharper, every sound amplified, the clinking of his fork against the plate, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tapping of rain on the windows. Her hand brushed against the weapon under her jacket as she stood in the living room, her mind consumed with images of his betrayal. She thought of the medical papers hidden in his gym bag, the late nights spent watching him flirt with strangers, the cruel reality that he had chosen silence while condemning her to a lifetime of consequences. To him, perhaps it was just another secret, another game. To her, it was the theft of everything she had once believed in. As Daniel moved closer, she felt the tension coil tighter in her chest. She could see his lips moving, could hear his voice, but the words barely registered. All she could see was his face, the face of a man who had smiled while hiding the truth, who had kissed her knowing what he carried, who had watched her fall in love without ever giving her the chance to protect herself. In that moment, he was not the man she once adored. He was the embodiment of the disease consuming her body and the lies that had devoured her spirit. Her training screamed at her to walk away, to call for backup, to handle it within the law. But the voice of an officer was drowned out by the voice of a broken woman who wanted justice that the courts could never provide. The sound of the storm outside grew louder, as if urging her forward. Her hand gripped the weapon, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and certainty. When the gunshot rang out, it was sharp and final, cutting through the air louder than the thunder outside. Daniel's body crumpled to the floor, the life drained from him in an instant. The smile that had once charmed her was gone, replaced by a lifeless stillness. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood frozen, staring at what she had done, her chest heaving, her mind both empty and overflowing with the weight of the act. For a brief second, a wave of relief washed over her, a release from the torment she had been carrying. But the relief was fleeting, swallowed quickly by the crushing reality of the scene before her. Blood pooled on the floor, the smell of dinner still lingering in the air, the storm outside continuing its relentless assault. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Rachel's weapon slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor as tears welled in her eyes. She had imagined this moment so many times, thought it would feel like justice, but instead it felt like collapse. She wasn't the strong officer anymore, nor the hopeful woman in love. She was both victim and executioner, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As the minutes stretched, she heard voices outside, neighbors calling to one another after the gunshot pierced the night. Panic surged through her. They would come. They would see. The storm had hidden nothing. It had only amplified the chaos, and as the flashing red and blue lights approached, Rachel realized there was no turning back. The path she had chosen had ended here, in a stranger's house that once felt like home, with a life lost and her own future slipping through her hands like the rain outside. The sound of sirens broke through the storm, their piercing wail drawing closer, until the red and blue lights reflected against the rain-soaked windows of Daniel's house. Rachel stood motionless in the center of the living room, her eyes fixed on the lifeless body lying on the floor. The blood had spread across the polished wood, staining it in a way that would never wash away. Her chest heaved, her breath sharp and shallow, her thoughts scattered between relief and dread. She had wanted this moment, told herself it would bring justice, but now that it was here, all she felt was the crushing weight of what she had done. The pounding on the front door came quickly, followed by the splintering sound of it being forced open. Officers flooded in, weapons drawn, ready for confrontation. What they found instead was one of their own, standing over a body with her weapon discarded on the floor. Rachel didn't resist. Her hands were raised slightly, her eyes glazed over, her expression unreadable. For a moment the officers froze, unable to process the sight of a colleague in such a scene. The silence was broken only by the storm outside and the heavy steps of boots moving across the blood-stained floor. She was placed in handcuffs, the cold metal biting into her wrists. The irony was not lost on her. She had cuffed countless suspects in her career, always with the certainty that justice was being served. Now she was the one being led away, her badge useless, her uniform forever tainted by the act she had committed. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering, pointing, their shocked faces illuminated by the flashing lights. To them, the story was simple. A police officer had killed her boyfriend. The reasons, the pain, the betrayal, all of it remained hidden beneath the surface. At the station, Rachel sat in a stark interrogation room, the walls closing in around her. Hours passed in silence before detectives entered, colleagues who had once trusted her with their lives. She didn't fight their questions. She didn't spin a story or attempt to hide the truth. In a voice stripped of emotion, she explained everything. The diagnosis, the medical records she had found, the women she had seen him with, the unbearable knowledge that he had known and said nothing. Her words painted a picture of a predator who had destroyed her life from the inside out. But the stark fact remained. She had pulled the trigger. News of the case spread quickly. The media latched onto the scandal of a female officer turning killer. The headlines designed to shock and provoke. Public opinion split sharply down the middle. Some viewed Rachel as a murderer who had betrayed her oath and used her position to commit a crime. Others saw her as a victim pushed beyond her limits, a woman consumed by betrayal and disease, who had lashed out in a moment of despair. Talk shows debated her motives, articles dissected her career, and strangers who had never met her argued fiercely over whether she deserved sympathy or punishment. The trial became a spectacle. Prosecutors painted her as dangerous, a trained officer who should have known better, who had allowed her emotions to override her duty. They described Daniel not as a predator, but as a flawed man, who had never faced his own responsibilities. The defense countered with the story of Rachel's betrayal, her diagnosis, and the mental anguish that had consumed her. They argued she had acted out of desperation, not malice, and that Daniel had deliberately withheld the truth, effectively stealing her future. Witnesses were called, including women who had once been involved with Daniel. Some spoke nervously, admitting they had left him suddenly, disturbed by his evasive behavior, Others denied knowing anything about his condition. The courtroom buzzed with tension as each piece of testimony built a portrait of Daniel that was far from the charming trainer everyone thought they knew. Yet, none of it erased the image of Rachel standing over his body with a gun in her hand. As the trial neared its end, the jury faced the impossible task of deciding whether Rachel was a cold-blooded killer or a woman broken by betrayal. The deliberations stretched on, each side weighed down by the complexity of the case. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom held its breath. Rachel was found guilty of murder. The sentence was heavy, a reminder that no amount of pain could excuse the taking of a life. Rachel listened quietly as the judgment was read, her face pale but calm. She had expected nothing less. In her heart, she knew she had crossed a line that could never be undone. As she was led away in shackles, she thought of the life she had once imagined with Daniel, the home they might have shared, the family she had dreamed of. All of it had turned to ash, replaced by prison walls, and a future defined not by her badge but by her crime. Her story remained etched in the town's memory. For some, she was the fallen officer who had succumbed to vengeance. For others, she was the tragic figure who had been victimized by the man she loved and then destroyed by her own response. Even years later, the debate continued. Her name a reminder of how thin the line could be between justice and revenge. Rachel Myers had once stood for law and order, but in the end, she became both victim and executioner. And as the world moved on, the echo of that gunshot remained, a chilling reminder of how love, betrayal, and despair can twist even the strongest among us into something unrecognizable.